case you think it was stolen. It
It
was.
happened here. That never happened here. I know that. So how long you been here, if I may ask? It's news council. I'm not sure.
Well, technically since May 1st, except that I went to Rosalind at the end of May. That's all I want to know.
Good evening and welcome very, very much to this segment of Conversations, where I'm very pleased to be speaking with Mr. Richard Salant. Mr. Salant is the president now at the National News Council after a long and distinguished career in news reporting within national television. Mr. Salant, welcome very, very much to Conversations indeed.
Good to be here.
Wonder if you might share with me the National News Council, when it was formed, what its charge was, and we could talk some about it and broader questions of media development and news coverage and so forth, but maybe you could share a little bit of the historical development of the council for us,
I'd be
please.
glad to. The National News Council was created in 1973 after a task force that had been appointed by the 20th Century Fund examined for a year in 1972 the question of whether there ought to be such a thing as a news council, using as a central model the British Press Council, which had been in existence for some time. After a year of consideration, the task force, of which I was a member, came to the conclusion that there ought to be a National News Council. Its report was made in this a free and responsive press. It recommended the creation of the News Council. It came into being in '73. It is now a little more than 10 years old.
And there was some precedent within the British experience for this.
In the British experience, there were some local news councils. There was one in Minnesota. There were at that time some in other foreign countries.
Yeah, and the National News Council's role in terms of the broader perspective is?
The National News Council does really three things. First, which was regarded as the central function, it was felt that the public, which felt that a story, a news story, whether broadcast or print, was unfair and inaccurate, ought to have a place to go other than the news organization of which they were complaining. If the news organization turned them aside, the News Council would give the complainant a second look on whether the story was unfair and inaccurate.
I see,
The second very important function, and I don't want to put a priority among these functions, was that the News Council was to vindicate the free press provisions of the First Amendment and speak out whenever it felt that there were any issues in which the First Amendment needed support.
Yeah. Now
the third thing that we wanted to do, and we have been doing, is to make general studies of recurring journalistic, ethical, and policy questions so as to provide guidance to news organizations. Problems like free press and fair trial, problems like confidential sources, problems of conflict of interest.
Now, we've had a press ever since the Constitution was established, and we've had an ongoing press relationship between, let's say, the government or public or private interests and so forth in the society and so forth. But it was felt in 1973 that there was a new kind of entity that was required, apart from those that historically we've been working in terms of dealing with these possible problems that would exist within the press reporting. And so
what we felt was that the press was becoming more and more pervasive, more regarded as having more and more power, and was losing some degree of credibility. That part of the reason for this was that the public had no place to go when it felt the press was unfair or inaccurate. And that is simply for constitutional reasons. The press, alone among all private free enterprise institutions, has constitutional protection against government intrusion. There's no other business that happens to. So you can't go to the government. And in order to provide a safety valve and some place for the public to go, and to protect against government intrusion, the News Council was established.
Sort of in a sense to have a quasi-position of responsibility moderating between those. We hadn't provided for that in the constitutional structuring of the
Happily, we haven't provided for that in the Constitution.
And we've long held to the idea of a free press, and a free and inquiring press is essential to the First Amendment and so forth.
That's right. And it was Hamilton who was opposed to the free press provision of the First Amendment. Fortunately, he lost, but he said that it wouldn't do any good to write any constitutional protection of freedom for the press because it all depended on the spirit of the people. That is, what the public felt about the press. Well, he was right that somehow or other the press can't function effectively if the public doesn't believe that the press is being fair. He lost that fight, and I'm glad he did because we need constitutional protection. But he was right on the impact of the public's view of the press, and our purpose in that respect was to provide a safety valve.
Okay, it was the public's view, and it was also, at the time, if I recall, Mr. Nixon and some other people had taken some exception to what the press had been reporting, and the increased recognition of the importance of the press,
as a
broadcast
free
and
institution,
print, in terms of establishing national consciousness in the sense of what it is really going on. It's a mediating influence.
That's correct. And we felt, and I certainly have always felt when I was head of CBS News, whenever I had anything to do with news, is that while we can't be accountable to the government, since we're surrogates of the people, we should be accountable to the people.
You mean as a press representative?
That's right. That's we, the press.
And do you think from your experience at CBS and in the news press organization and so forth, that those agencies, the traditional CBS, the networks, the print organizations and so forth, have been and attempted to be, in a sense of responsibility, responsible to the people, or has there been a real problem there developed?
There has been some carelessness. There have been some notable lapses where mistakes have been made. But the important thing is the public perception of unfairness and inaccuracy. It's very un-American. It's contrary to American experience and tradition for the batter in a baseball game to call his own balls and strikes.
Right.
But that's exactly under the Constitution. That is the arrangement for the press.
We didn't have any trade-off in a competitive situation. We have a number of news agencies, one of which would compete with the other. We wouldn't have been able to have a situation where one would present a more accurate presentation than another. So there would be a trade-off, so that there would be a competitive interest in terms of arriving at the truth and establishing that relationship.
That's
with
the
the
basic
public.
theory, that a diversity of voices would provide a choice in the public. Unfortunately, it cuts two ways. We know from experience that sometimes competition results in excesses. You try to get in first.
Yeah, right. You're always against that deadline.
And there's always that danger that competition will be perceived as resulting in unfairness and inaccuracy. And it has happened.
Yeah, there has been a number of inaccurate reports, and there have been, and those have gotten
unfortunate, we'll call them unfortunate lapses. I mean, a fictitious story that almost won a Pulitzer Prize by a very responsible newspaper, the Washington Post, that famous Jimmy's World. It turned out that there was no Jimmy.
Yeah, right. It was all fabricated, that kind of thing. And this helped to contribute to a sense of lack of faith in the news reporting capability, which was part of a general lack of faith there was among a great number of the citizenry in American institutions in general.
Exactly.
President Carter said we have a malaise.
Exactly. There's a general decline in American trust of our institutions, and the press has been one of the victims of that, and it cannot survive unless the public trusts it, or a majority of the public, most of the public. I think that there is always a hardcore 20-25% of the public who will never believe a press account if it doesn't say what they want it to say.
Yes, right.
If it doesn't feed their biases.
Right, yeah.
And there's nothing, you can't try to get credibility there by playing to their biases.
Right. So that sense of credibility would be just simply the bias toward the news or what is being developed, or maybe some of it would be political objection to what it is that's going on. It gets confused
It's
sometimes.
the people who kill the messenger because they don't like the message.
Yeah, right.
And I think that's what happened in the storm that was created during the days of Agnew and Nixon.
Yeah, sure.
There were many supporters of Agnew and Nixon who didn't like what the press was reporting.
Or people who felt that the press had a hand in undercutting our position in Vietnam. There were people who felt that these kinds of, the national passion was high.
Exactly. What I'm saying is that the press can't play by the numbers and try to please everybody at the same time, because sometimes, very often, the messages that we have to deliver, because they're news and because they're true, are still unpalatable to a lot of people.
And very often, if they would report something in the news, and then even if someone had been, if there was a mistake, they'd made a mistake, and then they went to try and get some retribution or correction, that might be ignored, or they might not be treated properly or something.
That's where we
play a part. It was
play
a closed shop as far as the citizen is concerned.
people who were genuinely concerned about fairness and accuracy and not with the substance of, they just didn't like what was being reported.
They didn't like the reality.
They would complain to the newspaper or the news magazine or the broadcast organization, and quite often the only answer they would get is, "We stand by our story."
All right.
Now that's very frustrating
Stonewall
to the public.
Yeah.
And so we established the News Council in order to give those people a second look.
All right, and to give them some other agency to come to that could be a sort of intermediate agency between them and the and a private group. Important, there'd be a private group and not a governmental
exactly.
agency.
Now you have to keep in mind that the essence of the News Council is it's voluntary. We have no sanctions. We can't force and don't want to force any news organization to do anything. We can't punish them. We can't force them to print corrections. We can't prescribe a code of conduct, and we don't want to.
Okay, you don't want to. But in the interest of the legitimacy and the sense of legitimacy of the industry itself, it's good that there be a place that calls attention to mistakes or inappropriatenesses as they occur.
And that we would hope in the long run that the News Council would so conduct itself that its opinions when it decides these cases or issues statements about fairness or journalistic ethics or the First Amendment, that they would be so persuasive.
Yes, right.
That the news organizations themselves would
see
raise their consciences and say, okay, we think we were right, but the News Council found we were wrong, and report that.
And now that it's reported, and there would be a list of people responsible who understand the realities of the everyday world, as well as some of the implications of the constitutional implications, so what they'd respect the opinion of the council reports as they're coming out because of the integrity of the council.
That's
itself.
right. Although
you'd have to maintain a very high integrity yourself.
Our first objective and target, I think, must be, since the public is so large and amorphous, is to get the press itself to examine what we've said and what we've done, and voluntarily, after they first get over being mad about being criticized, raise their consciences, and the next time they handle that problem or that kind of issue, or be more careful.
Yeah, well, I should think in a certain sense that could serve their interest. They could see it that way, and a great number of people within the press were instrumental in helping to get the council going.
That's precisely.
And they have an interest in keeping the council going.
That's the whole point, that we think it is in the interest of the press itself and press freedom for the News Council to exist and do what it's doing.
There are probably a number of people within the press world with all their problems and deadlines and things they're doing and saying, oh, we just don't need that. We know what we're doing. And can there be, we had a discussion of an arrogance of power within the political process. Can there be that developing within news circles and so forth, do you think?
There has developed, and this is over 10 years we have not accomplished nearly as much as the task force thought it would accomplish, and part of the reason is because a number of important press organizations, the New York Times being the bellwether in it, say, who needs that? We'll solve our own problems. And if the press doesn't report what we say and doesn't pay attention to what we say, the consciousness of the press will never be raised, and we're we're just hopeless.
Well, then you really do need the support of the press themselves, as well as an enlightened citizenry about what you're doing. And
that's right. But we can't get an enlightened citizenry unless they know about us.
And you can't get that unless there's some press coverage. You have to get a press coverage, right?
If we get blocked at the threshold, at the first gate, by the press is not supporting us, not heeding us, and not reporting on what we do, the public never knows about us.
Well, then you need to be sure and have access to the press release process so that the information can get out to people that you do come up with. Your studies.
That's why I'm doing this interview.
Very good. I'm glad that you are. And so you should be able to get interest of journalism schools and people who have a broad question of civil liberties union people. I mean, other kinds of people who have a broad sense of social responsibility. I should think would be interested in the work of the council.
Exactly.
All right.
Exactly. And those are people that we're trying to persuade.
Sure.
Because perfectly frankly, we're entering our second decade now, and we don't have as much to show for the first 10 years as we wish we had. And we're trying to solve that problem by persuading news organizations and, as you say, journalism schools, journalism critics,
people
public
of broad
entities
social
to know about us.
Yeah, right. Yeah, surely. Yeah, sure.
I think we have a very important function to perform in our society, because a free press is really the keystone of a democracy.
Oh, absolutely. There's no question of that. And the fact, as you indicated before, the increased significance of the press and importance of the press.
Exactly, and our purpose
particularly with the television and all, is very, very significant institutions.
Our purpose is to strengthen that freedom by a better performance of the press, which it accepts voluntarily.
And that's a little bit difficult. It's calling for some schizophrenic catch-22s.
It is difficult, but there has been progress that has been made. Some 31 newspapers around the country, and in a way 2 network news organizations now, CBS and ABC, have ombudsmen who deal with complaints by looking into them, giving fair and honest answers. There has been a really great progress, I think, especially among newspapers. The New York Times is maybe a leader, and the Louisville Courier-Journal, in being willing to make corrections in their own pages when they've made mistakes and they've decided they've made mistakes. The New York Times does a fine job there, and they've even gone beyond making factual corrections. They've established a policy of something they call editor's notes, where they have decided they themselves have been unfair. They have an editor's note correcting that just in the last couple of weeks. They had an editor's note. They had done a story in which they presented only one side. They had a note saying, we only presented one side. Here's the other side. Now, that's a fine thing.
That's a fine thing in a man or woman or good citizenship, and particularly so with an institution.
It's against human nature. None of us like to admit we might make mistakes. And I think that's real progress.
And yet we all know that it's good that we can be self-critical when it's appropriate and we can see it, and that that's a better way of living, and it helps you progress into the world in a better kind of way.
There was a notion among some news organizations that to admit that you ever make a mistake would destroy your credibility. But everybody in the public out there knows we make mistakes. We're human beings. We're fallible. And as human beings, we do make mistakes.
We've been talking about individuals and so forth. What about like if it's a special interest group or an interest group that's well organized, an industry organization or something that feels they've been maligned or upset or something like that? That's a different proposition, or do you deal with that, or is it a matter of individuals?
We'll take complaints from individuals, from organizations, from anybody that thinks that there have been unfair or inaccurate reports, or would like us to deal with questions of journalistic ethics.
Yeah, and it's becoming increasingly important. The Mobil Oil Corporation has been taking advocacy advertising to that effect and so forth, and some of those people have. So there have been some free market forces operating, but then there's even some problem in that, I guess.
Well, the trouble with Mobil, you see, is the Mobil ads, which I find very, very, very powerful, very persuasive, is the public doesn't know. Is Mobil right? Or are the news organizations that Mr. Schmerz is criticizing right? We're here to resolve those questions if anybody will bring those questions to us.
Yeah, I was trying to think if we couldn't have like the grunch of giant. They're giant organizations. They could, in a certain sense, in that competitive marketplace notion of information or understanding, couldn't sort of like in a way sort it out. But it's good that there be a mediating influence there between them, and that there be some understanding to where we can get at a responsible understanding of the press.
Yes, curiously, you've got a very good example there. Mobil, which is taken to the op-ed pages with his advertisements, and Mr. Schmerz, who is a very effective spokesman, makes lots of speeches. Mobil won't support the News Council.
That's interesting.
They won't bring cases to us.
That's interesting.
I wonder why would them why.
What would be your guess, or would you want to venture?
I think that they, as far as I could tell, and I wasn't on the News Council at that time, they did bring a complaint to the News Council, and they didn't like the News Council result. I think the News Council found that the complaint was warranted. But then, because the News Council has no sanctions and can't make a newspaper or a news organization do anything, they felt dissatisfied because nothing happened. But that's the nature of our business. We don't
like
want
the UN.
sanctions.
Sometimes maybe it feels a little bit like the UN. Sometimes you have this moral force and so forth.
Yeah, theoretically, the UN has sanctions. We don't.
You don't even have that.
We have no multinational force, and we don't want any.
No. But it's important. You have to maintain your credibility and the sense of integrity for the reports and things that you do. That can be a little bit difficult because you have to make sure that you got everything straight before you go ahead and proceed.
That's
right.
But I
go off half-cocked with something.
I don't want to be unfair to Mobil. I'm not.
No.
I don't know the reasons why they fell off our wagon, and they'll have to speak for themselves on that.
Or any of the other groups that might have been able to give more support to this kind of notion, or they don't quite understand why it's there. But it's important. It's an incredibly important function that we'd be able to get some sort of monitoring, or it's in the, I guess the bottom line interest is that we have the most accurate and appropriate kind of reporting of the realities, as it were, to the American citizen. That's the bottom line, really, what we're going after.
A free press is as important as it can possibly be to a democracy. There is no such thing as a democracy without a free press. And everywhere where you find a free press, it is a democracy. But at the same time, you want a free press to be fair and accurate in order to maintain its freedom.
Yeah, you don't want constrictions put on to the point where they can't function in that process themselves. Reporters and so forth, they're getting the information. It's important that they have that, but that there's a heavy responsibility that goes along with it.
There are two things that can destroy a free press. One is government intrusion.
Right.
And as long as we have the First Amendment and the Supreme Court, which varies a little in degree on these issues, you can't have government intrusion, except in broadcasting, where you do have some degree of government intrusion. The other thing that can destroy a free press is to lose its credibility. For too many people to say, it's unfair, it's inaccurate, I'm not going to pay any attention to it anymore. And that's where we think we can help.
You don't think in a case if it's untrue, unfair, you know, some sort of yellow journal, something like that, that they'll go out of business in the long run? Or, you know, again, I don't think people come back those marketplace things. That they will read the ones that say, well, that's just an irresponsible reporting, and they'll get that reputation, it'll be gone.
There's a mixed history there, and that's a good question you've asked, because if you go back on the history of American journalism, and if you go to the press as it existed at the end of the 18th century in America and through the 19th century.
All print now, right?
This was all print.
Yeah.
They were shrill, they were unfair, they were advocates. You would read some of those things and some of the newspapers, and you couldn't find a fact in there. It was all opinion.
Yes, right. Yeah.
There was really yellow journalism, and in fact, originally, in the American press, after the Constitution was adopted, there were only 8 newspapers, and the majority of those were owned by the political parties. Owned and run.
Yeah, right.
And it was only in the 20th century that the press started to examine itself and discovered that there were enormous virtues to being objective, to trying to find facts and report them fairly and accurately. As late as the 4th decade of the 20th century, a Secretary of Interior during the Roosevelt administration wrote a powerful book, which was generally accepted as true, about the one-party press. And I can recall one presidential campaign, I guess it was 1952, where a major paper out west was so opposed to Stevenson, who was then the candidate, that when he came to campaign in that city, the only notice in that paper of his visit to the city to campaign was a 1-inch item on the society page saying that he had come to town to have lunch with friends.
I'll be darned. Right.
Now this doesn't, this
it doesn't
by
happen,
and large
no.
doesn't happen. You can find a few outrageous papers, and each of you name your own favorite on either side of it. But in general, with everything that's happened, the press today is fairer and more accurate than it's ever been.
Yeah,
but the public perception is more critical.
Yeah, right. And the public perception and the public awareness and the general level of awareness and the general level of understanding, in a certain sense, is rising. People are becoming more educated.
That's right. That's not
more critical themselves.
That's right, and that's a good thing. That's a good thing. The more critical the public is, the more demanding it is, the more it insists on fairness and balance, the better off the press is. Sure, you have to put aside some of the more biased and destructive criticisms, but in there's a kernel of legitimate anger and inaccuracy and unfairness.
Yeah, just inaccuracy and unfairness in and of itself, apart from the issue involved.
That's
which
right.
is another thing. I mean, it can
right.
come out that way,
That's
in an adversarial kind of way, but I mean, it could be just
That's
as the issue itself.
And the problem is compounded, especially in print, because the vast majority of cities in this country today, which have newspapers in their communities,
Single paper?
are relying on only a single paper.
That's right. It's going that way. That's a tendency.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
I
that's
think
the
there are
problem.
only a dozen cities where there are two competing papers or
Right,
more.
right. It's a very real problem, and the question of the editorial bias and the bias and the
That's
way
right.
the news is.
So the safety valve of diversity
Yeah, right.
is disappearing, especially in print. It is not so in broadcasting.
Yeah, how about broadcasting? What is it? Do you have figures off the top of your head, perhaps from your experience?
I'll have to give them to you.
People who gain a sense of news from
it's very
electronic
surprising.
media, it's pretty high.
I think, on average, anybody who has a television station set can get 8 different stations, over-the-air stations. Now add to that those who are hooked up to cable, and that's now about 40% of the population, and it's increasing all the time.
Right.
38%, I think, were the latest figures from Arbitron yesterday.
All right, right on the money.
And growing up, that's increasing over 500,000 a month, I think.
Yeah.
And they have 36 channels, 12 channels, 100 channels, on which all sorts of things go. Then there will be the satellites that can broadcast direct to the home.
Broadcast, they're actually starting now, yeah. Comsat's coming on.
And then there are those small stations that have been authorized by the FCC, the low power stations. So that the irony of it is, in broadcasting there is a much greater trace of sources than there is in print. And yet broadcasting is subject to content regulation in the equal time provisions and the fairness doctrine, where the Federal Communications Commission can intervene on those things, even though there is far less scarcity than there is in print.
Although traditionally there has been. The 3 networks have ruled pretty much. I mean, traditionally and on a national basis, and the power of the networks is...
If you talk about national and international news, yes. There are only 3 networks that provide national and international news, 3 over-the-air networks.
Yeah.
There is now also CNN.
Yeah, but I mean,
cable.
Historically, those 3 networks have been pretty strongly established.
But if you say that makes broadcasting different from print, one must realize that almost all, we have very few national newspapers, and almost all newspapers in the country are dependent for national and international news on only 2 organizations, both good, but only 2, AP and UPI.
Yeah, right, okay.
So
true,
again, there's less diversity there than there is in
I
broadcasting.
wonder how did it come about in the Communications Act of '34 that they gave the FCC and that governmental regulation over broadcasting? You know, you have to regulate bandwidth, spectrum, and that kind of thing. But the content questions, how did that come into being where it isn't applying to print?
I think they simply stumbled into it without realizing what they were doing.
Really? Yeah.
And
That's happened on other issues. Yeah.
That's right. Once it got there, it's much harder to remove something that becomes a policy or a tradition.
Yeah.
I should make it clear that there are some people whom I respect a great deal that think that this is a good thing. That is, broadcasting ought to be regulated on fairness and on equal time and so on.
I wonder if there are people who feel the print press ought to be regulated.
Well, that's
that
the
way,
irony.
And the book publishers ought to be too.
There's
Some people who would think that.
There was a study made by a very good organization named the Public Service Agenda Foundation, which studied this general problem a couple of years ago and came out with a very, very interesting report in which it found that a majority of the people would subject print to the same regulations of fairness, government regulations of fairness and equal time and so on. But they can't do it constitutionally. Constitutionally, they cannot do it, thank goodness.
And as far as that's concerned, on the electronic media and the government's FCC view and so forth, haven't people, that had been the fairness doctrine in order to give a balanced view, there have been people who, if they got a complaint about broadcasting, something would come on that would be objectionable, they would take and lodge that with the FCC.
Absolutely, absolutely. You used to get, before the FCC
they get inundated
started,
sometimes.
You'd get inundated by the FCC 20-day letters. Say, we've got this complaint, answer it within 20 days. And no matter how hard you try, there are going to be some broadcaster that would find that was quite chilly. But that's a whole nother issue. It's one of the ironies. It's one of the things that bothers me. It is not a position. It is not an issue on which the News Council has yet taken a position.
Yeah, and there are a wide variety of public. There are a wide variety of print-oriented. If you have, you go on a newsstand now. There's an incredible variety of things that come out. Special interest publications. Some of them politically different. Some of them this way, that. There's a wide variety of print things, and increasingly so in the electronic media.
That doesn't provide. You're right, but that plethora of magazines,
100,000
especially
little small magazines.
They're not what we're talking about. They are essentially, and they play a very important role. They are essentially opinion magazines. They're not news magazines.
And
And so, God bless National Review and New Republic and
yeah, that
Nation
thing,
and
that kind
such.
of thing, right?
But those are opinion things, and the more of those there are, the merrier.
Yeah.
What when I go to sleep at night and dream about what I really love to do is make people who read the Nation or the New Republic also read the National Review and vice versa.
Yeah,
Unfortunately, there's no cross-fertilization.
Rob Sennett's got that idea.
That's right. So
Yeah.
people only pick the opinion magazines that agree with the opinions they already have.
Yeah.
That's too bad, because you never keep an open mind.
I was just thinking, though, in viewing the media and the press reports on particular realities as they develop news or realities or a sense of reality or philosophy or whatever you would have, if there's something comes up that is an appropriate kind of reading of it over here and you got somebody monitoring that, they'd pretty quickly pick up on that, as you would, and then they would, but then even if they do pick it up, they could put it in their pages, but it's good that even if they have that objection, even if it is coming from an opinionated position on a point of fact or something, they could bring that to you.
There's nothing
There's
in the world
nothing you
as
could work
healthy
together.
as robust debate.
Right, okay, that's what I was getting at,
That's right,
If
that's
they have
right.
robust debate, but it's good that they'd be able to have a place beyond their own pages to take that
Exactly,
sense of that.
exactly.
But that there should be a wide variety of monitoring of the press as well as the general society.
Yes, but I should
particularly
make
the
clear
press.
on that, because there is a special immunity, if you will, or one should give special encouragement to robust debate.
Yeah.
The council will not take complaints directed against the opinions in editorials or editorial comments.
No, I wasn't thinking that.
No,
I was thinking
I
that
just
they
wanna
would
make
they
sure
would be
everybody
particularly
understands
no,
that.
I understand that, but they would be particularly
You're right.
adroit at picking up an inappropriate or an inaccurate fact. If it's a matter of
Absolutely,
fact,
you're right,
they
you're
would pick
right.
that up because they'd be having interest in monitoring.
And they do.
And they
do.
would. And if
Yes.
they're general radicals within the society and so forth, they would perhaps monitor the kind of things with a kind of jaundiced eye that other people might be able to be a
And
little
vice
less
versa.
critical.
Exactly.
And there should
exactly.
be an opening on that critical kind of reading of the
Correct.
press as well as the general
Correct.
society. And then there should be a place where that can be taken beyond just the limits of their own publishing capability, which is already biased and obviously opinionated in the way they approach things, but someplace where they could take that to a national council that is, in a sense, got a broad responsibility
that's
for the
true not
overall
only on-
integrity of the news
right.
reporting process.
That's true not only on questions of fairness and accuracy, but it's also true, unfortunately, on press freedom issues. And I'll give you an example. Almost all news organizations and that is newspapers and broadcasters, as well as associations like the Society for Professional Journalists and so on, protested the government's blackout of coverage of Grenada. And there was a tremendous outcry. But in today's newspaper, in the New York Post, there is an article in the news pages, not the editorial page. It should have been on the editorial page. There's an article really condemning the networks and other news organizations for complaining about that blackout. Their position is that there should be a blackout when you go to war. Now, okay, they're entitled to their opinion, but this is the kind of issue that one ought to deal with.
Right.
And it is an example of one's political or social philosophy guiding one's conclusions about what is First Amendment rights and what isn't First Amendment rights.
Right, it is. And these are all questions that are really very, very important as we begin to move into an information environment. Change is coming so quickly, a sense of pace and great deal of sense of alienation and a sense among great numbers of people in the general
and the judgment
society.
of what the press ought to be doing or oughtn't to be doing, what it ought to be able to cover and what it oughtn't to be able to cover, is really in considerable part political. It depends on
we live in a political
on your
world.
social. Absolutely, that's good. That's good.
And and you would take in a complaint, as it were, from any element within the society.
Surely.
Communist Party, U.S.A.
Sure.
They found something effective. There's no reason at all not to
Or-
deal with them,
or
or
that-
radicals or anything like that.
All they have to do is complain and persuade us that the basis of their complaint is accurate.
The basis of their complaint is accurate in fact,
In fact,
not in opinion.
that's correct.
That's important. And if they've got some sort of an objection to the society or something that's reported, now you wouldn't take something of a general nature of a general complaint. They would have that, but on the basis of the fact and the way it's reported. Great. So we could have these number of these radical agencies that
yes,
could really read
I'll
the...
give you an example of one organization that has discovered that and has filed lots of complaints with us, and in many cases we've upheld their complaints. It's, I'm going to give you the approximate name, the Irish Unity Council or Committee. It is a group that is very supportive of the IRA.
Right, okay.
And very
right.
anti-British.
Right, right.
And every time they spot what they think is an inaccurate statement about the Irish side of this,
Right.
they complain to us.
All right, all
They
right.
complain, they file complaints against the Daily News, against the New York Times, and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And where it is a fact,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and we find that the fact has been misstated by the news organization, we so find.
Yeah, yeah, they're likely to have in some of those reports some of their own opinions
That's
and stuff,
right.
but you can shift that out.
And this is a
And-
special interest group. And we've had complaints in the past, none pending at the moment, from groups that are very supportive of Israel,
Yeah.
complaining
Right,
about the coverage of the Mideast.
Right,
We
right.
take that. The fact that a special interest group is all of the good. That's
Yeah.
that's what we're there for.
Well, you would take something from a special interest group in support of the PLO.
Sure.
If they felt like that. Because the source really isn't that important as it is the question of the accuracy of what's being done.
Exactly.
And the bottom line is the overall accuracy.
One of the most dangerous things that can happen to the press is that it is careless and inaccurate and unfair to groups that are unpopular.
The pariahs.
That's right.
Yeah, so the pariahs of the world
right.
come to the National News Council. You
Pariahs
must,
are
right,
just
but
as
no.
much entitled
Right.
to protection against unfairness and inaccuracy as the largest and most established part of our establishment.
Yeah, but don't bring all your irresponsibility to it. Bring it out and sort it out, and it would be, in a certain sense, like a kind of quasi question. You ought to have lawyers who know the evidence as a fact, the law of evidence, and all that kind of thing.
No, we don't get. We
No,
don't.
you don't have all attorneys.
We're very eager to keep this from being a legal process.
Right. Okay.
Otherwise,
okay,
we
that's
would
important.
decide our cases about 2 years after they become relevant.
Yeah, but again, you're yeah, right, because you'd be researching and researching
right.
and and
Cross-examination, and hearsay,
yeah,
and
you
all
can.
the
So
rules of common law.
you've got to have enough point where you can begin to proceed. And then what you get a report like that, then do you publish news releases or something? Or
We publish
how do you
news
make what you
releases.
find available? To
We publish news releases and we hand deliver them to some 17 organizations,
News
AP,
organizations?
UPI, so on. We send copies immediately to the people involved. Then every 3 years we publish books which contain all our decisions, and those are sent to libraries and journalism schools. This is the second one, covering 1975 to 1978. We have at the printers now the ones covering 78 to the present. That'll come off the press in the next month or two, and we distribute those as widely as our funds will permit.
Right, it all has to be done within an economic context, right?
A very small economic.
And you're not in a profit making mode here. So
our ambitions are very large and our purse is very small.
Pursuit of the truth is not always the best way to a good, clean
That's-
profit.
we're
Is it?
not-
Or is it? No.
No, we're a non-profit organization.
Right, okay, I
Boy, are
understand.
we non-profit.
No, yeah, well, that's all right, but you're doing an important work. It seems to me there's a lot of sister agencies and so forth that would be very interested in aligning themselves with you and helping you in the work.
We would hope so, but it's been disappointing. Our budget is very small. We're now engaged in a fundraising drive.
Oh, well, that's
just so we
help,
can exist, and I don't know. I hope it's going to come out all right. We've got a small budget.
Yeah, right. And you have to meet those things, and you have to get it out somehow. How has the response been generally? I mean, if you pass on these reports, do the people that are responsible in the news agencies and so on, do they get those in? Do they put them out? Do they let people know about that? Or what's the attitude toward the information that you put out? That's important information.
In general, the answer is no, especially here in New York. We had our last meeting December 1st, December 2nd, and you could not find in the New York press one word about any of our decisions, even though one of the decisions, at least, was a decision that I thought would have been quite interesting. It involved the Frontline PBS documentary involving corruption and gambling in the National Football League, and we found one aspect of it was unfair and inaccurate. When that broadcast went on the air, there were articles all over the place in the New York press and in Sports Illustrated and so on, criticizing the broadcast. We found some of that criticism warranted, but nobody here in New York City could have the slightest idea of that decision by the News Council if they read newspapers or news magazines.
All right, here's a case. There was a case where there was a reportage going on, and there was a piece of information you put in there that was inaccurate. Let's say, and it could be important like that.
Yes.
You said there were reports of that within the press. People reported that inaccuracy or letters.
They
to the
criticized
editor.
the original. They
criticized the original inaccuracy.
The sports columnist for the New York Times, for example, tore the broadcast apart.
All right.
And Sports Illustrated had a major column tearing it apart.
Right. Okay. So those are people, in a certain sense, researching that question. question of
right.
inaccuracy that was done now,
Then
right?
we had a complaint involving, we found the complaint warranted.
Right, so people brought that kind of general thing that was put out in the society to you, and
That's
you
right.
went into a real look at it.
That's right, and then
And
we
then you
investigated.
issued a report.
We issued a decision. The News
Right.
Council issued a decision last, just a couple of weeks ago. AP, UPI put it on the wires, and I have found that
That's a
in
great
smaller
boy in the sky,
newspapers
people.
around the country,
Yeah.
they did report that
Yeah.
particular one, but not here in New York. So
Not here in New York.
nobody even knew we did it, and in New York you go to 100 people selected at random, and if you can find one person who ever heard of the News Council, you're lucky.
Yeah, it's not well known, is it?
I
It's
should say
not.
not.
It's not well known. It's behind the scenes kind of thing.
I'll give you an
It could be-
illustration of how unknown we are. I attended a symposium a year or so ago that was being conducted here in New York about the way news organizations, newspapers, and television news treats business. It was a symposium attended by some 20 or 30 public relations vice presidents of top corporations here in New York. And they recited chapter and verse about all the terrible stories that had done, how unfair and inaccurate. And though I was just an observer, I couldn't contain myself any longer. So I said, how many of you have ever taken any of your complaints to the National News Council? There was dead silence, and then I realized I should ask the next question.
How many of you ever heard of it?
How many of you? Not one hand was
Is that right?
raised.
Is that right?
Although these were professional press information public relations officers of large corporations.
That's incredible. That would be the
Well,
case
I
that
found
they wouldn't know.
not so incredible.
Where
as I
else
found
would
it
they take it?
disheartening.
Where historically would somebody who's in that position take it? I mean, there was no place to take it.
No
Maybe
place
they
to
got
take
over
it.
the idea that there is any
No,
place
no,
to take it.
they
where
talk
people-
to themselves at dinner
Yeah.
about how terrible the press is.
And that's coming now from the standpoint of certain business interests and that kind of thing, special interest groups and so on. But they just didn't think there was any place that in the public interest, in a certain sense, were looking at these questions, and and there hasn't been
That's right.
historically. So you've got a
That's
precedent-setting kind of thing you're trying to do.
That's correct.
You're plowing
So
synergistic grounds
But
here.
that was a measure of how even people whose profession it is to deal with the press on behalf of their companies don't even know about it.
Is that a certain thing, like in a sense, when the story first comes out, that's exciting? Maybe there's an inaccuracy in it that helps make it exciting. But then when you go around to the footnoting, it seems like a footnote, and it just doesn't seem very exciting. And people aren't going to buy papers, and they don't care. It's just not. It's important, but it doesn't seem dramatic or something. Do you think that's
I don't understand. On the other hand, CBS News, which has been a supporter of the News Council, made a commitment 5 or 6 or 7 years ago. I know because I was then head of CBS News, and I had a part in that commitment being made. Always to submit itself to the News Council on any complaint, and a further commitment that if the council ever made adverse findings adverse to CBS News would report that fact on the same broadcast series where the error occurred.
Don't you think that's a good?
How good can you get the color with that?
Well, you can't with that set. I mean, that's
Yeah.
hopeless.
Well, let's see, just for the hell of it, you can convert it, it says, you can't better than that. The green and the red are all separate. Took it dark on it, I guess. Could have some, tea or something, or maybe I should just.
Well. Yeah.
I think this is a slow
Pioneering.
process.
Yeah.
We're doing something new. We're running against, as I said before, human nature in trying to get people to submit to us on questions of whether they were in error. Further, we would like them to admit error when they made it. All those things, none of us as human beings like to do.
Do these things come into, comes into like so much of political, economic world, do these things come into economic questions? Because findings and that kind of thing would have consequence in a court of law, where if there are libel cases or something.
No.
Is there a great deal of that kind of thing going on in the society now?
That's important, though.
Yeah.
And again, you raise a very good question. We will not take a case, and here we borrow this from the practice of the British Press Council. We will not take a case unless the complainant waives his right to any legal recourse.
Oh.
So that if somebody wants to sue for libel, they can't come to us and get a hearing and find out all about what the defense is first. If you're going to sue, we won't enter the case. We don't want to become a part of the legal process.
And the findings are not able to be admissible in a court of law or anything?
I hope
like that?
not.
No,
I hope
all right,
not.
and it's important. I'm just trying to understand.
I hope not. If they're admissible in the
Yeah.
court of law and become part of the governmental process, then I would say, speaking for myself,
Yeah,
I don't
right.
know,
It's good.
we should go out of business.
Really, yeah?
Because the whole theory is that we must be voluntary and we must not be in any shape or manner or form a part of official or governmental process.
I see. Well, that is interesting. I was just thinking in terms of the operation of the society in general, that there are people who have seek redress of grievances for inaccuracies done by the president. Often people might lose millions of lives or something. I mean, in dollars, let's say, or a real loss by an inaccurate report.
Then they can go to courts. Then they can go to courts.
But aren't they, in a certain sense, when they do that, coming to you for a redress of grievances?
Well,
in
if
a
they
certain
do that,
sense, right?
we're
What
an
is it?
we're an alternative.
All right.
If they're willing to give up their rights to sue and get money back, and have us have a look at it to see whether they were right or wrong, whether the news organization did them wrong, so to speak,
All right.
we'll take it, but not if we're just a first step in the litigation process.
Well, what about the question where there would be, let's say, in the question of, so that they would get a retraction maybe or something like that, but if they go through and then you say, well, we find that they were inaccurate and they publish that and they go, and then the news entities don't even bother to put that in their thing. What, I mean, people would get a little bit, they'd like to see something a little bit more substantial than
Well,
that. Maybe
that's true. They wish we had more sanction, but we can't operate as a voluntary organization
Yeah.
appealing to the conscience of the news organizations if we have that kind of sanction. Now,
Right.
there
Okay,
is
it's important. Yeah.
there's a former head of the editorial page of the Des Moines Register-Tribune named Gil Cranberg, who's now a professor at the communication school at the University of Iowa, who has gotten a grant from a foundation to make a year's study of what alternatives there are to libel and libel suits, which are a mess right now.
Yeah, I know. There's so much of it.
And one of the things he's considering is whether something could be set up so that the News Council can be an effective alternative to libel. That is, for example, one of the things they're playing around with is if the complainant will submit to the News Council as an alternative to suing for libel in the court, and the news organization says, okay, we'll submit ourselves on this case to the News Council.
Arbitration.
And they agree that if the council finds against them, they will print those adverse findings and not answer back. That's the alternative to libel, and that may work. I don't know.
Right. Well, all right, an alternative to libel, but again, that wouldn't get at the question of some sort of economic.
No, we can't have any. We can't give economic redress.
If you had been president of
But as
CBS
a matter
and you
of
had done
fact,
something and and you proved something wrong, clearly
Yeah.
wrong, it was a mistake on your part, you made a mistake, and then they could prove without any doubt in private counsel or something that because of that mistake they clearly lost, let's just say for a figure, $100 million that they would have had if you hadn't done that and you lost that for them. Would you have felt a responsibility to find redress that if you had been president of CBS and you made that mistake? Or would
At cost of $100 million?
Yeah, and it would clearly demonstrate that
The first thing I
it would
would-
be clearly shown.
since
right?
it would be
well,
my
not 100,
respons-
let's say 100,000, but to make the point,
the first thing that I would
just
do,
as a redress.
since as head of the news division, I would be responsible for that. The first thing I would do is say, look, I've done a bad job. I resign.
Oh, well, 100 million. Well, let's make it 1,000.
No,
just to make the point. I mean,
yeah,
that there was an error that could be measured in economic terms or something, or in other terms.
I would think so. I would think so.
That a fair-minded representative agency like that would want to
hypothetical.
try.
I think
Okay.
that
But that's
there-
what's behind all these libel cases and things that are being done.
Well, the law of libel is so erratic right now that
Yeah.
nobody knows. As a matter of fact, it hasn't gotten much attention, but the American Civil Liberties Union reversed a position that it's had for many, many years within the last year, saying that where it's a libel involving a public issue, the First Amendment forbids it altogether.
Okay.
And there's a respectable body of opinion that supports that. I don't think the public is
Right.
quite ready for that, or the courts are quite ready for it.
Okay, I didn't mean to press that anyway, because a great deal of the kind of accuracy questions and so forth that you deal with wouldn't really get into that kind of thing where there would be litigation.
No, but the
and if it
question
is
you
in
ra-
litigation, maybe it's another thing than what the kind of thing you should be dealing
But
with.
you're quite right. The question you raise is very important, is whether the News Council can serve as an alternative to the unsatisfactory litigation process. And I don't know just how it can, and Professor Cranberg is studying that, and I can't wait to see what he says.
Yeah, and they might be able to deal with questions in a way outside of that litigation process and so forth, in a way that can get at the truth, which everyone has an interest in, but it keeps it into an arena where it doesn't get so acrimonious. All the problems it does.
One of the
It's a different
problems
thing,
is
yeah.
once it gets into litigation,
Yeah.
especially for a small newspapers and so on,
Right.
libel litigation is so expensive they can't afford the lawyers.
Yeah,
for
and
it.
hasn't there been a lot of that going on now? I mean, Dan Rather and
That's
and
right.
a
Oh,
lot
and
of
small-
this, and Mr. Westmoreland now is now.
Well, and small
yeah.
news organizations,
Small
Alton
organization.
Telegraph, for
Yeah,
example.
But I don't know. Is there something going on?
And a little paper called the Milkweed.
Yeah.
All of us just couldn't afford the
Yeah,
litigation,
yeah.
and it's
Do you think the litigation process and the difficulties, let's say, in terms of the executive responsibility for our news agencies, as litigation is bringing about, or that is going to infringe upon their ability to take a chance with news and so forth?
absolutely.
Is it a problem?
Absolutely, especially in small news organizations. Stories that the editor is convinced are correct and ought to be told are being spiked because they simply can't.
You mean they're being
They're being killed. They're not being published.
killed. Oh, right.
Because they feel they simply cannot afford the litigation process where the standards of proof are different, and it's a long process. I understand that
And they daren't take a chance.
in one case, not the Westmoreland case, involving CBS News, there's been a case that has been pending now. It hasn't even gone to trial. It's an examination before trial. It's been pending for 8 or 9 years.
Wow.
And I understand it's cost CBS in legal fees somewhere around $3 or $4 million.
Incredible.
Well, CBS maybe can afford that, but a small organization can't.
Well, CBS can't afford that very long. I mean, that's a lot of money. I mean, you can't just go on endlessly doing
this.
This
Is just legal fees.
Yeah, right. I understand that. But I wonder, do you think that process in and of itself, that the difficulty of that, is that going to be incentive to make sure that the inaccuracies that maybe they've been a little too cavalier about in the past will occur, so they'll be so accurate it won't even need you because everything will be accurate because they wouldn't dare put anything that wasn't.
If that creates a higher standard of care,
I'm just
fine.
suggesting in a sense.
If, on the other hand, it creates timidity, we can't take a chance because we might get sued and we can't afford to, it's a very unfortunate thing.
Yeah.
That's the problem.
Yeah, right, exactly. That's a problem that faces the whole society in a very real sense.
Yes, we all in news tend to say our problems are worse than anybody else's.
Yeah, right.
But the fact is the whole litigation process for all elements of our society has gotten so complex
I know.
that people can't afford to go through it. It takes too long.
We could never afford to have a really appropriately organized society. All the lawyers would be out of work, and they'd be all unemployed and so forth.
Well, then they'd all
if
go
the
to-
society was really a good working order.
They'd all get elected to the Senate.
Oh,
the
well,
Congress, but
there
most
is a
of them are
Senate for
not.
that right now. I was just, but I mean, it's true. And then we do live at a time of, it's an old cliche and so forth, the time change and technological innovation and the transformation of the workplace and all of these other kinds of transformations that are occurring so quickly are undercutting the sense of identity that people have had in established institutions. It's almost exponential, the rate of change. So it's a time of incredible change and anxiety, and so it's
and the sense of helplessness. The
for
individual
a lot of
can't
people.
do anything.
Right. And they'll have a certain,
But there's another question involved there. My lawyer friends hate me for me to say that.
Oh,
I've always wondered why all judges have to be lawyers. Wouldn't it be nice to have a few laymen?
a few plumbers on the bench to understand these, but they couldn't get
understand human nature.
Oh, understand you. It might be true that there could be a great deal more of that kind of understanding. It's not all a matter of the law. It's true. The president of Harvard said that. Matter of fact, he said he thinks we're turning out far too many lawyers and creating.
And our society is much too litigious. That's right. Derek Clark, it was quite a notion he had.
Yeah, right. Because
but it's true.
Yeah, it is true. Well, it's a reflection of a difficult time. We're in a time of transition, a time of change.
It's also a reflection of the feeling that wherever there is a wrong, or what you think is a wrong, you ought to be able to sue for it.
Right.
And I wish there was some other. And I'm not talking now about the press. I'm talking about
in general
problems with your landlord, problems of
Yeah.
of your collecting your welfare checks
Right,
or
right.
whatever.
Right.
Problems with what you think are dangers to your environment.
Yeah.
To have-
Atomic bomb.
There ought to be some way of settling these things without going through the very, very burdensome and lengthy process of litigation.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But I don't know what it is.
No. Also, it's hard. Maybe we should have some philosophers there who can read a broad understanding of the broader evolution of human affairs. Because we, at the same time, there's all these difficulties. We do live at a time that promises an incredible cornucopia, nearly, of material abundance and almost affluence, in an unprecedented, it's an incredibly almost pregnant moment we live in.
This is why you see going more and more to informal small courts, those small claims courts and family courts and arbitration that get away from that endless litigation.
Right, and it also might be good if on both sides, if there could be a sense of, if you did something wrong, take care of it, and have a sense of that rather than we're going to fight and everything, and have it be reasonable, rather than...
What we're talking about, and really this is related to what all along the segments of our society and the disputes that arise in our society, not just libel, not just disputes with the press. It would be very good if there were better ways to resolve those disputes.
That's right.
Than the difficult problem of litigation.
Yeah, right. And also, beyond that question might be one if we could have a broad social, economic, political order, maybe on a world scale, that would be so harmoniously meeting the needs of our citizenry on a world basis that we wouldn't need to have so much litigation. That would be an idealized kind of view.
Ideally,
and the promise is there of a world that could
ideally
be
what would happen is that if Smith gets into a dispute with Jones over any issue, whether it's his rent or his welfare or anything.
To come to the National News
The two of them, no. The two of them would get together and say, look, we can't agree. Let's agree on somebody who we really trust and let him decide it.
Right.
We'll talk to him, we'll present what we think is our side. Let him resolve this.
That's supposed to be in our judicial
That
process.
would
It
be nice.
might be better if the bartender might be able to do better than the judicial process. But in any event,
I don't go to bars, so I don't know how. They'd be very reliable.
Well, all right. The pour the tea. But in any case, they would have. I understand exactly what you're saying. There should be this kind of thing, a greater sense of sort of camaraderie, a sense of that. If we could have that kind of thing.
A willingness to submit to something other than suing.
Right, absolutely, right. And it's good in the case of the information environment, particularly as it relates to broadcasting and news, that we have an
because
agency.
you have First Amendment issues.
Right,
there,
that comes up very important, and that's
right.
got to be about safety. And that we really do have, and as we enter this information environment, it would see, if I may suggest, that it's really important that we have a kind of agency such as the National News Council. I congratulate you on the work that you've done, and I certainly do wish you all the very best as you move increasingly into this informational environment that you've had a hand in creating and helping to keep responsible. I'm terribly sorry, even in cable television, where we have more time, we run out of time. We run out of time for this segment.
I'm sorry, but many thanks.
Not at all. It's my pleasure. It's been a pleasure. And I'd like to remind you, in the cable television audience, it's been your pleasure to have the perceptions of Richard Salant, who's the president then of the National News Council. Happy to have been able to share his views and some of the views of this important and growing agency, the National News Council, playing an important role. Happy to bring you those perceptions and invite you to tune in again next week. That's it for this week, Mr. Salant. Once again, thank you really very, very much indeed for everything.
Thank you.